Little girl says there's someone under the house sold for millions, but moments later, something incredible happens. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream sliced through the afternoon air like a blade, echoing through the streets of the small historic town. The 52-year-old millionaire nearly dropped his coffee cup as he moved away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the colonial house across the street, a 2-story yellow clapboard building that contrasted sharply with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone since he lost his wife on a rainy night he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the colonial house, the 4-year-old girl cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her few years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly, having heated it on the gas stove, her eyes red from the alcohol fixed on the child, trembling before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the booze she'd been consuming since noon at the local dive bar. "O'Malley's. Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only infuriated her Aunt Moore, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. "Stop whining," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal all over the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was slightly open, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, the man felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the colonial house, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the house. The family had always been troubled, but since the woman had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It'd been a long time since she'd had a proper conversation with her, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, But something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to get back to work, but he couldn't concentrate. His fortune, built through careful investments and real estate deals, had given him everything money could buy. But that afternoon, for the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical movement of the town waking up for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her most gentle smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the aunt to retreat. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely little girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 children. You know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. She'll get over it soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs that she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not without casting an investigative glance inside the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the colonial house, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height did not allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in the room?" the aunt snarled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal that she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So, she began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while she worked. She always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl whose name, the realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. His ex-employee's daughter was named exactly the same as the child who was suffering in the house across the street. How hadn't he made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered the woman mentioning family problems, a sister with whom she didn't get along, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his ex-employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time the man didn't move away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the colonial house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the millionaire couldn't pretend that they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His assets, built through years of hard work and careful investments, had given him the power to solve many problems. But this was different. This was personal. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act. His financial assets and capital accumulated over the years gave him resources, but he lacked courage. The same emotional inertia that had consumed him since he was left alone paralyzed him again, even in the face of the evident suffering of a child who had a direct connection to his past. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that haunted him. On that Thursday morning, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by evident burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved timidly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, honey," Mrs. Henderson replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just drawing birdies." "How lovely. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot." "They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke Mrs. Henderson's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Mrs. Henderson needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. Mrs. Henderson remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen, the burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to her aunt's voice. Everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived, and now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Henderson made a courageous decision. She put on her best business attire, grabbed a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the colonial house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed with the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Henderson, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Mrs. Henderson had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades in the classroom had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame. Maybe another time then," said Mrs. Henderson, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Mrs. Henderson and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Mrs. Henderson smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help, it was a subtle but direct warning. After Mrs. Henderson left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing Mrs. Henderson's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with the familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt took the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His profits accumulated over the years, his dividends and passive income, all that lost its meaning if he couldn't use his resources to protect an innocent. The man made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, David. "David, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life." While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman had finally found the courage to act. But what he didn't know was that his actions would trigger a series of discoveries that would reveal much deeper and more disturbing secrets about his own company and the fate of the child's family. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, the girl managed to sneak out into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that in the coming days, her life would change in ways that she couldn't even imagine. David arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a serious expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at the university almost 3 decades ago, and David knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. That's why the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said David, sitting down in the spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked David, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." David was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact the authorities immediately." "I know," replied the businessman, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She quit abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," David completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with this woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and David could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" David watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney's office. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the night. "How many times do I have to tell you not to dirty the walls?" shouted the aunt, holding the girl's arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. Around noon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The social worker, accompanied by 2 officers and a child welfare worker, was heading to the colonial house. Mrs. Henderson had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. His lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said David, putting his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team that was approaching the colonial house. In the house, the aunt had left to buy alcohol at the local dive bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the social worker knocked on the door of the colonial house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Henderson who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team through the hallway. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, without understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said the social worker, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Henderson, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be angry," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said Mrs. Henderson, reaching out to the child. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" But it was when the team was about to leave with the girl that the biggest discovery happened. Among the papers scattered around the house, the social worker found documents that revealed a shocking truth. The aunt had forged the child's custody. The girl's mother hadn't left, as everyone thought. The document showed that the woman had been admitted to a psychiatric clinic 3 years ago, excessively medicated and kept sedated by her own sister, who had appropriated all her assets, including a small inheritance left by the child's father. But the most impactful revelation came when they discovered that this inheritance included shares of a small company that had been bought by the businessman's construction company years ago. The girl's mother owned shares in a piece of land that had become the basis of one of the largest real estate developments in the region. David, analyzing the documents, made an even more surprising discovery. The ex-employee hadn't simply resigned. She had been removed from her job when she began to investigate irregularities in land purchase contracts, including the one that belonged to her own family. The construction company, without the businessman's knowledge at the time, had used questionable practices to acquire properties, including the sedation of owners in psychiatric clinics. The financial manager who took care of these operations had been the same man who organized the forced admission of the girl's mother. When this truth came to light, the businessman felt the weight of his fortune in a completely new way. His investments and his net worth had been built in part on the suffering of this family, but now he had the opportunity to correct those mistakes. The girl's mother was immediately taken from the clinic, where she had spent 3 years sedated unnecessarily. When the doctors gradually reduced the medication, they discovered that she was perfectly mentally healthy. She had been the victim of an elaborate embezzlement scheme. The reunion between mother and daughter happened in the hospital, 3 days after the rescue. The girl, who had forgotten her mother's face due to trauma and time, immediately recognized her voice singing the familiar song. It was a moment that made everyone present cry, including the businessman who watched everything through the window glass. The millionaire not only restored all the values that the family had lost with accumulated interest, but also transferred to them the ownership of the land that had been fraudulently acquired. In addition, he established an investment fund that would guarantee the financial future of the child and her mother. The aunt was removed and received treatment for alcoholism, while the corrupt financial manager was fired and prosecuted. The businessman's construction company implemented new ethics and transparency protocols, ensuring that similar situations would never happen again. 6 months later, the girl played freely in the yard of her new house, a modest but cozy property that her mother had chosen carefully. She still drew birds, but now they flew in true freedom, just like her. The businessman, who had found in correcting these wrongs a new purpose for his wealth, visited the family regularly. He had discovered that sometimes the greatest fortunes are not measured in dollars or assets, but in the lives we manage to touch and transform for the better.